Hi everyone, thanks for joining me for this screencast video in which we're going to cover the early Cold War politics at home in the United States, really covering the time period of the late 1940s into the early 1950s. And in this video, we're going to in particular take a look at President Harry S. Truman, his really domestic policies during that time period, as well as a senator by the name of Joseph McCarthy and his role in the second Red Scare that'll take place in the early 1950s. So, where you can find this content we're covering in the video in your textbook is going to be in chapters 19 and 20. And furthermore, please make sure you're taking some quality detailed notes from the content that we're covering in this video. Make sure you feel free to stop the video, go back, pause it, and then get the content that you need to take those notes. So again, as I mentioned, we're really going to focus on President Harry S. Truman and what were his policies here at home domestically for the United States. We've looked at how he takes over the presidency in April of 1945 when FDR passes away. And that obviously, late 1945 is tumultuous time period. We see Truman is now going to be the one to decide how World War II is going to end. We've looked at that with the use of the atomic bombs against Japan, but most importantly, he's also going to be the president in a time period that the early Cold War is starting between the emerging two world superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. So there are some policies that you need to be aware of that pertain to Truman and what was his plan at home. Now we've looked at his foreign policy with the Cold War. His foreign policy with the Cold War was going to be containment, right? Stop the spread of Soviet communism. But his domestic policy is the Fair Deal. And this obviously borrows its name from the New Deal. He wanted to see the continuation or the expansion of New Deal policies that were started by FDR. So some of the things he wanted to do was he wanted to expand healthcare, make universal healthcare for all Americans. He wanted further protection for labor unions, knowing that if American workers had protections that would give more stability to the American economy as well as families. He wanted to see the advancement for civil rights. We kind of looked at this already, and the integration of the armed forces that's going to take place in the late 1940s. He also is going to be crucial in starting the Fair Employment Practices Commission, in which the federal government looks at advancing more minorities to obtain employment within the federal government. Unfortunately, all of this is going to be opposed quite heavily by Congress. Both conservative Republicans who did not want to see the continuation or definitely the expansion of New Deal programs, but also Southern Democrats, even members of his own political party, especially on the area of civil rights. So let's take a look at that. One of the ways that conservative Republicans are going to come after Truman's sort of advancement of labor and workers' rights is going to be the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. This is actually an anti-union law. We'll get into some of the provisions in just a second. And Truman hated this law. He actually tries to veto it, but Congress is able to override it. So what this did, this anti-union law, it ended New Deal labor policies that were put in place, such as the Wagner Act, to protect American workers. And so the law allowed now employers to prohibit closed shops, meaning that you didn't just have to hire union workers. You could hire people outside of the union to work for you. Unions had to take non-communist loyalty oath. It also stopped unions from making donations to political campaigns, so you could not support a politician running for public office financially. That would obviously be beneficial to you if that politician was elected. And then lastly, it interferes with their ability to strike. It requires that there is a 60-day cooling off period before a union could strike and walk out of the job. So again, all of this is rolling back New Deal policies that protected the American worker. Furthermore, to take a look at why this is happening, obviously Republicans favor more of big business than the American worker, but the other reason why Congress wants to see an act like this in place to limit the ability of unions and the rights of unions is because even in the 1940s, Americans are still identifying unions with political radicals, that unions are really a harboring place for anarchists and communists and socialists that are going to do harm to the United States. So that explains why this act is going to pass even over Truman's veto, and again have devastating effects for the American worker. The next area that Truman is going to be challenged on is his stance on American civil rights. Truman absolutely wants to advance civil rights and go beyond what FDR had done. Truman believed not only was it the right thing to do, but in the years of the Cold War, we looked hypocritical. Here we are telling third world countries to resist communism because communism was going to infringe upon civil rights and liberties. But here at home, we're not even protecting the rights of minority groups from discrimination, like African Americans. And so, one of the first things that Truman does is by executive order in 1948, he integrates the armed forces. We've looked at this in how Korea, it's the first war where we're going to see white and black soldiers fighting on the same lines in the same regiments. Again, Congress has a major issue with this, especially those within his own political party, the Democratic Party. And so, what starts to happen is Truman stands on the civil rights. It threatens many Southern Democrats. And we see Southern Democrats splitting from the Democratic Party, creating what's known as the Dixiecrats. The Dixiecrats were state rights Democratic Party supporters, and they're led by this guy here, Strom Thurmond. He was a senator from South Carolina who was adamantly opposed to civil rights. Many southern states said, what's next? The federal government is now making us integrate the armed forces. What's next to come? We're going to integrate schools. Yes, that will shortly happen in just a few years. But that was the fear of these Dixiecrats. So their party will abandon Truman in the 48 election on this issue. And the 48 election was difficult for Truman. Many people thought that he might not be winning this because Southern states would split the Democratic vote. As you can see, Thurmond actually runs for the presidency and garners a few Southern states. If this would have been more than what he acquired, it would have been very easy for the Democratic Party to split the vote, and the victory would have went to the Republican candidate Dewey. And many people thought that this was going to happen, that Truman was not going to win. And I love this very famous picture of the night that Truman does win the presidency. He holds up this failed publication that went to print way too early that announced that Dewey was the projected winner and not Truman. But those are going to be the two major challenges to Truman's domestic policy, and even by his own party on the issue of civil rights. The other thing that Truman is also having to deal with domestically at home while president is the second Red Scare. Again, we're going to see a mass wave of hysteria in the United States against political radicals, especially communists, that they are trying to overthrow the United States government. And so this is an extension of the first Red Scare. There's a lot of similarities or parallels to the first and second Red Scare. The first Red Scares we looked at took place in the late 1910s, early 1920s, and it was post World War I hysteria that these political radicals, anarchists, communists, Bolsheviks were going to come in and throw out a democratic system of government here in the United States. And unfortunately, as a result, we see people targeted that were unfairly targeted and civil rights were violated. We're going to see immigrant groups targeted. And unfortunately, that is going to happen again in the second Red Scare. There's also some other causes behind the second Red Scare and the hysteria that we start to see Americans start to experience. So in the 1950s, communism is not just an imagined enemy anymore. It's a concrete form of the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin, who are trying to spread the communist ideology. We also see, too, some events happen that is also going to make Americans very weary. In 1949, we see communism spreading to a large country like China. We also see the Soviets develop their atomic bomb. That puts us in a very different position in dealing with the Soviets. We can no longer really muscle them around like we did previously. And then, furthermore, the Korean War begins in 1950. And by 1952 and 1953, it's a deadlock, it's a stalemate, the war. And so, all of these things combined, it prevents or creates an environment in which people are searching for someone to blame for why this is happening. And really, we're going to see government officials, just like with the first Red Scare, take advantage of these fears. And they're going to suggest that the communist conspiracy is among us in the American nation. And so let's take a look at the government's response to this. Truman's response to the second Red Scare is pretty moderate. He in 47 by executive order calls for a loyalty program. We're going to investigate any type of disloyal American. And so if you were a federal government employee, he is going to have loyalty boards set up with this executive order in every department or agency of the federal government that will investigate the loyalty of that department or agency's employees. And so they're looking at, who do you associate with? Who are your family members? What are their political ideologies? Unfortunately, okay, a few hundred are going to lose their job because of this. And again, there's no clear evidence that they themselves were disloyal. They just were sort of guilty by association. But the organization that becomes very reckless and absolutely elevates the second Red Scare in the late 1940s is going to be in a committee within the United States Congress called HUAC. You must know this and write this down. It's very important. HUAC will absolutely elevate the fears of American and create more Red Scare hysteria than there should have ever been. And so HUAC stands for the House Un American Activities Committee. And this is a committee that is in charge of holding hearings and calling in witnesses and looking at how is American society being infiltrated by Soviet communist spies or those that are just sympathetic to the Communist Party. And so a couple things here. HUAC is absolutely known for civil rights violations. It called people in that really had done nothing wrong. But the fallout of being called before a HUAC committee, as we'll look at in a second, it ruined the lives of thousands of people. The other thing, too, is HUAC is going to present a platform for politicians to make a name for themselves. And you can see in this picture of a HUAC committee meeting or hearing, I have someone sort of, circled or highlighted here. That is a young congressman from California that will get his start in American politics through HUAC. And that is going to be future President Richard Milhouse Nixon. He is a great example of how a politician can go and form a committee and participate in the committee that will act irresponsibly, but at the same time come across as in appearances that they're protecting the American public. And that served to elevate his political career greatly. In just a few years in the 1950s, Nixon will actually be Eisenhower's vice president in the 52 election. So he really skyrockets politically because of his involvement here. Again, getting back to HUAC, it's a committee that again was looking to try to find how are we threatened by Soviet communism. And they went after a number of people. They went after politicians and federal government employees. They went after teachers in public schools or in colleges and universities, professors. What are you teaching our children? Are you sort of brainwashing them to be sympathetic to Soviet communism? But a great example of what their focus was very early on, was the Hollywood 10. They really looked at the entertainment industry. And so the investigation actually led to the prison sentences for what's known as the Hollywood 10. These were 10 individuals that were leaders, owners, CEOs of the major Hollywood film companies at the time period that are producing and directing and financing a lot of the major Hollywood motion pictures that are coming out. And so this committee is calling the Hollywood 10, and many of these people were from Eastern European descent, and they were calling them to participate in HUAC, and many of them just, basically used their Fifth Amendment right to not answer questions. This led to them being held in contempt and sent off to prison for a handful of years. Ultimately, all members, the Hollywood 10, educators, anybody who was called before HUAC, you quickly found yourself blacklisted. This is when a list of persons who are under suspicion, again, they've not done anything wrong. They're just under suspicion or they're disfavored. You are not going to be hired, you are not going to be served, or just overall widely accepted in American society because it is suggested you could possibly be a Soviet communist sympathizer or spy. And so HUAC, unfortunately, in its quest to protect America and democracy, will do more damage than good. It ruins the lives of thousands of people, and the Hollywood 10 is a great example of that. There's also going to be a number of pieces of legislation coming out of Congress, too, on the heels of the second Red Scare, that again are going to fringe greatly upon people's civil liberties and also discriminatory against certain groups of people. And it's led by these two men here, Senator Pat McCarran and also a rep in the House, Francis Walter. They're responsible for pushing through legislation in both houses. The first one is the McCarran Act of 1950. And this is going to require all communists to register with the United States government. Any communist groups, the Communist Party, you were required by the federal government to give a list of your members to the federal government. Again, any type of privacy or freedom to believe what you want is going to be undone with this unjust act. The next one is the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952, and this is going to reaffirm immigration quotas that we had saw from the first Red Scare. So immigration restrictions are going to be placed on communist countries. We're going to restrict immigrants coming in from the Soviet Union, Soviet satellite countries in the Soviet bloc, and especially China, as well as some Asian countries and Latin American countries that we start to see a growing influence of Soviet communism in. So, again, another example about how trying to protect American democracy and liberties, we're actually doing more harm than good. Now, of all fairness, okay, this post war second Red Scare hysteria was to prevent spies from infiltrating the United States. And I have to be fair here and mention those fears were not unwarranted. There were some high profile spy cases, again, of Soviet spies infiltrating the United States that I think we have to be fair to mention. So the first one is going to be the Whittaker Chambers case. This was a guy who was a Soviet spy, you can see, in the 1930s. He was actually editor of Time magazine during that time period. But then after 38, he sort of sees the light, knows what he's doing is wrong, and he turns himself in, and he sort of becomes an informant for the United States government and starts telling them who all these spies are. So in 48, he's brought Chambers before HUAC, and he starts making some accusations that there are people who are Soviet spies working for the federal government. And one of those people is Alger Hiss. He accuses Alger Hiss, who is a federal employee within the State Department, who has a major role with foreign policy, of being a Soviet spy. And Chambers says he can prove it because Chambers has these documents that prove Alger Hiss was a spy, and he kept them in this hollowed out pumpkin on his farm for safekeeping. These documents, known as the Pumpkin Papers, again, are going to be investigated here by a young, up and rising Richard Nixon in HUAC. And ultimately, Alger Hiss is going to be tried for perjury, imprisoned for a handful of years, and he's going to maintain his innocence until his death years later. Another high profile case is going to be that of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. This was a married couple with a few young children. They were open members of the Communist Party, and it is believed that they are going to be the spies that were passing off atomic bomb secrets to Soviet spies, getting them back to Moscow. And that's how the Soviet Union was so quickly able to catch up and develop their own atomic bomb by 1949. We had talked about that and how someone by the name of Klaus Fuchs infiltrated the Manhattan Project. Well, it's believed Klaus Fuchs, along with Ethel Rosenberg's brother, David Greenglass, were the ones that were sort of getting the information out of the Manhattan Project. Okay. Greenglass was an employee of Los Alamos research headquarters of the atomic bomb, and they were getting the information out and passing it to the Rosenbergs, who would then pass it off to another, sort of in a network of spies to get it back to Moscow. So Ethel's brother here, David Greenglass, is going to basically turn against his sister and brother in law, and he's going to testify against them to save his own rear end. Unfortunately, in 1953, the Rosenbergs are both going to be executed. And this has been long debated among historians. Many historians do believe that absolutely Julius Rosenberg, the husband, more than likely was involved within the spy network of smuggling nuclear atomic bomb secrets out. But many historians today believe that Ethel more than likely was innocent. And again, this is very reminiscent of that 1920s case of Sacco and Vanzetti, that we see two Italian immigrants with unpopular views, like Ethel Rosenberg, basically, going to pay the ultimate price for a crime that they probably did not commit. And it's because of that post war hysteria that is being perpetuated by politicians in the United States. The last thing I want to focus on in this video is really when the second Red Scare gets completely out of hand. And that's going to happen in the 1950s, very early 1950s, known as McCarthyism, named after this man right here. So the final phase of the second Red Scare is known as McCarthyism. And again, it's when this hysteria gets completely out of control. It's led by Joseph McCarthy. He's a Republican senator from Wisconsin. And many critics suggest that McCarthy, this lackluster politician, was desperate to make a name for himself. And he saw how popular people like Richard Nixon were becoming. And he thought, for a winning issue, let me sort of play off the fears of people, and that will elevate my position and my standing in American politics and reassure my reelection in 52, which he does. So McCarthyism, really his tactics come out of something called the Hatch Act. In 1938, it was made illegal for a federal government employee to be a member of the Communist Party. And that's what McCarthy says, that's his target. So in February of 1950, McCarthy's at this public speaking engagement in Wheeling, West Virginia, and he gets up to the podium and he starts speaking and he says, there's communists among us in the federal government. And he says he has in his hand a list of over 200 people who are known communists working in the U.S. State Department, and Americans are dumbfounded. Now, this number will go down from 200 to 80 to about 57. And no one ever sees this list, but it's enough to get McCarthy what he wants: popularity, a space in the American newspapers and on television. And this is ultimately going to be the event in his tactic that pushes him to the forefront of American politics. And so I love this telegraph. It's a telegraph from McCarthy to Truman, basically a few nights after that speech in February of 1950, telling the president that he has found out there is about 57 communists who are basically harboring a nest within the State Department. And also, I love Truman's response to McCarthy. Truman isn't buying it. He says here, I read your telegraph from February 11th, and it's a great deal of interest. And from the first time in my experience, and I've been in the Senate for 10 years, that I ever heard a senator trying to discredit his own government before the world. This isn't done by honest public officials. And then in the last paragraph, he says he's sure the people of Wisconsin are extremely sorry that you are representing them, as you are a person with a little sense of responsibility. And that sums it up perfectly. McCarthyism is now used to refer to any time a politician makes uncontrollable and unproven accusations to attack characters of others, especially their political opponents. And that's what McCarthy did. McCarthy made very scandalous and out there accusations about how people were Soviet spies and they were infiltrating the US government without any proof at all. Sometimes he would present doctored photos or some fake evidence that he created, but it was just basically him yelling and screaming about it. And unfortunately, it works for a couple of years. Americans buy this, and he absolutely elevates post war hysteria. So, again, this is a term that's still used today. Anytime we see someone go after somebody else's character with an unproven accusation, it's called McCarthyism. And it does get out of hand quite a bit. Joseph McCarthy and his supporters actually go after organizations such as the American Girl Scouts and say that they're sympathetic to communism because of their slogan of one world. Gets completely out of hand. But yet, no one is able to bash or put McCarthy in his place, because if you did speak up against McCarthy and what he was doing, and even HUAC and what they were doing in the late 1940s, you then ran the risk of being identified yourself as a communist spy or sympathizer. And that's why even the then president of the United States, President Eisenhower, remained silent. And this is also going to greatly lead to the conformity of the 1950s. Nobody wants to be different. If you're different, then you must be a communist spy or sympathizer. So he is a controversial figure, and some people backed him. Some people backed McCarthy thinking that he was this Cold War warrior that was going to protect the United States, but others saw right through him and thought he was absolutely a threat to American civil liberties. And one of the few that was able to speak out is a U.S. Senator by the name of Margaret Chase Smith, one of the few females in Congress at this time period, and she was from the state of Maine. She actually makes this speech on the Senate floor called the Declaration of Conscience. And she says there is nothing wrong and there's nothing un American to criticize or protest or to hold unpopular beliefs or to think for yourselves independently. And that doesn't make you a communist. Again, she never specifically states McCarthy in this speech, but it's absolutely targeted towards him. In classic fashion, what McCarthy does is he attacks her. He gives Chase Smith the nickname Moscow Maggie, and he actually uses his might within the U.S. Senate to have her removed from a couple committees, as well as unsuccessfully finance a run against someone to take her Senate seat, which again he does not successfully do. But again, this is an example of somebody who steps up and speaks out against McCarthy and is quickly hit by him. So McCarthyism is absolutely dangerous, not only to Americans and civil liberties and politics, but also the Republican Party. And I love this political cartoon that illustrates that. We'll take a look at more of Herb Bloch's cartoons in just a second. So ultimately, McCarthy will be responsible for his own downfall. He goes too far. So from 1950 to 1954, he is busy spewing unfounded, unsupported accusations against a number of Americans. And finally, he goes it too far. In 1954, McCarthy will actually accuse the U.S. Army of harboring Soviet communist spies. And that's sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back. Okay. President Eisenhower is not going to sit by and allow McCarthy to disgrace the U.S. Army. Remember, Eisenhower is a five-star general. He has devoted his life to the armed forces. He is not going to let this bully sit by and discredit that organization. So Eisenhower actually calls for Congress to investigate this, and that's where we see the Army McCarthy hearings take place. And this leads to Joseph McCarthy's downfall. This Army McCarthy hearing is basically a comedy show. Basically, McCarthy is asked to bring evidence to prove these accusations. He brings some doctored photos, some other fake evidence, but nothing holds up. And he looks like what he truly is, a rude bully. For the last 4 years has ruined Americans' lives. And this causes him to lose favor. Again, this hearing is one of the first that's going to be televised. Many Americans watch it. Here's a scene out of a appliance store, because many of these men, probably World War II or Korean War veterans themselves, supporting the Army, are watching these hearings because they don't have a television yet in their own living room. And so eventually, again, this breaks McCarthy. He is no longer invincible. The Senate, as a result of these hearings, is going to censor or condemn McCarthy. And unfortunately, McCarthy lives for a few more years. And in 1957, he dies of alcoholism. He's broke, discredited, but yet his legacy lives because of that term McCarthyism. We still see the practices that are named after him conducted in American politics today. So, the last thing I'm going to leave you with here is, again, when Americans are afraid to speak out against wrongdoing they see politically happening, sometimes we look to the arts to serve that purpose. So there's two artists that are very well known in 1950s for actually creating art, literature, and cartoons that highlight the wrongdoing of the Second Red Scare of HUAC and Joseph McCarthy. One of them is a very famous playwright and author you probably have heard of, Arthur Miller. He was actually one time married to Marilyn Monroe, but he's mostly known for his work, Death of a Salesman, and then The Crucible in 1953, which is definitely an allegory between McCarthyism and the Salem witch trials and making that parallel. The second person who uses his art, again, to convey criticism against what is happening is Herb Bloch. Herb Bloch was a very famous editorial cartoonist, political cartoonist, also a writer, worked for the New York Times, Washington Post for a number of years. And in the early 1950s, Joseph McCarthy was one of Herb Bloch's recurring targets, that he wanted to poke fun at really the nonsense that McCarthy was having Americans believe regarding the false accusations on a number of different organizations and Americans. And it's because of Herb Bloch, it's actually the coin McCarthyism is first coined or introduced by him. So, stopping here, this is what I would like you to do. I would like you to go back to our activity on the Second Red Scare on Canvas. And I have two options. You're going to pick one. You can either do Arthur Miller's analysis of McCarthyism. This is going to be an interview from an interview from Arthur Miller in 1996, talking about his writing, okay, and the experiences of McCarthyism that encouraged him to write The Crucible. So I have some questions down here you can answer. Or the second option is you could look at Herb Bloch's political cartoons if you're more visual. So this will give you 5 examples of Herb Bloch's political cartoons. And in the boxes provided, please write a short caption that explains what is Herb Bloch saying about the Second Red Scare or McCarthyism during that time period. Again, there's a little question here at the end as well. So again, you're picking one of those activities to complete, and you're submitting that along with your notes from the video that we just watched on the Cold War politics at home. If you have any questions, please make sure you reach out and let me know what I can help you with.